discipline specific, involve more than one theory, intentionally to scope.
Janae, I don't know if you want to put the music back up. That'll stress people out.
Oh yeah, definitely. Intervention models are more complicated than research models due to the vast diversity and amount of levels involved. True or false? Right. Definitely. This was definitely illustrated by like the elaborate models that Dr. Anderson has drafted for her own research. Theory and conceptual model differ in several ways. What is something both have in common? Both describe associations among constructs. Both provide a visual picture of the question under study. Both exemplify global behavior, none of the above.
And Janae, just FYI, I don't know if your sound is sharing. It's not a big deal at all, but just to let you know.
Oh, okay.
No worries at all. No worries.
Okay, I will fix that next time. I can hear it on my end, which is strange. Okay, good job, you all. What are the characteristics of a conceptual model described as the following, except informed by more than one theory, informed by empirical findings, concerned with global classes of behavior, conceptualized at multiple levels?
I'm sorry. So is this question asking which of these do not describe a characteristic of a conceptual model?
Yes. Sorry, the wording is a bit confusing here. Differences between participants and non-participants in a study which result in false conclusions is called sample difference bias, internal consistency reliability, non-response bias, convergent validity. Okay. Some work to be done, not to worry. Variables added to a study to understand the relationship between two other variables are called independent variable, dependent variable, third variable, or association variable.
So I'm recognizing we use different language on Monday for that. So we'll try to integrate that today in our recap of it.
Okay. When making a conceptual model, choosing design elements such as font colors is irrelevant to the final model. True or false? I think we talked about this a tiny bit last class period. Okay. Good job. Yeah, of course. We know that the way that the conceptual model is designed can definitely be important for readability purposes and conveying your point. A single theory is usually sufficient to incorporate all variables of interest to conceptual models in health education. True or false? I know you guys will all get this one right. Okay, good job, everybody. Which is not true regarding research-oriented conceptual models. They encapsulate what researchers have chosen to study. They contain associations among constructs. They are used to predict or explain outcomes. They are intentionally broad. Right. So although it may seem like conceptual models are intentionally broad, they're supposed to be folks' best attempt to be as specific as possible to narrow down the scope of their research. The elaboration model of data analysis is beneficial because it can determine the causality between two variables, encourages clear-cut definitions of constructs, considers third variables and analyses, is able to test multiple theories at once. Okay. All right. Well, congrats to these three.
And I just have to laugh a bit because as stressful as that music is, without it, it's just not the same. So now we know we can either be stressed and competitive or just sitting in silence, biting our nails, waiting for the answer. I know, Carly, I know. So let me share my screen again. I'm gonna repeat the feedback that I was giving on the videos real quick, and then we'll get into, let me make sure I shared my sound. I don't know if I did that. Well, I guess I don't even need it right now, so that's fine. Okay, the feedback that I was giving with respect to the video was that you all did an absolutely fantastic job. The one note that I wanted to make was about CVPR. So it looked like some people were using the term community to describe a population or to talk about just a group of people writ large, but just making sure that you're mindful of the actual components of CVPR. There are a number of ways that people describe it, but just getting at some of the elements like partnerships or needs assessments or working with people throughout the entire process was something that our guest lecturers discussed. And it's also in the lecture PowerPoint, and we didn't have time to go through the PowerPoint after the guest. But if you do need a bit of a refresher, those elements are there with last week's PowerPoint and guest lecture. So please refresh yourself on that if you need to do that. But again, by and large, fantastic work. We were obsessed. Truly amazing, amazing work. All right, so today's journey, we're gonna have a guest lecturer, which we're both Janae and I are super excited about, and I'm really excited to have this person with us. We'll do some application and we'll dig into our op-ed starting today so that we'll be nice and prepped for next week. So today, oh no, well, I'm gonna give a shout out first to my grandfather. So happy Veterans Day. We're celebrating folks like Romeo Baker who have served. This is my very handsome grandfather here who served in the Navy for World War II. So shout out to those folks celebrating their veterans today. Okay, now I'm super excited to introduce to you future Dr. Rebecca Israel Cross. So let me pull up her bio. Rebecca is a doc student at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health in the Department of Community Health Sciences. Her research involves measuring racism-related social determinants of health. Broadly, she aims to unpack the relationships between racism, neighborhoods, and health. Her dissertation examines how gentrification and racial resegregation impact preterm birth among Black women in Northern California. I'm also really excited to have future Dr. Israel Cross with us because you've met a number of my colleagues through the Robert Wood Johnson programs. We're the culture of health leaders. Rebecca is the first of our HPRS scholars, or health policy research scholars. And these are scholars at the doctoral level. So I was blessed to meet Rebecca several years ago. I've become one of her informal mentors, and it's been a pleasure watching her develop over time. So within the Robert Wood Johnson family, we have different relationships between the programs. And I'm super excited again to watch her development and growth, and really excited to have her come today as a doc student and demonstrate some of the content that she's been thinking about with respect to conceptual models to you all. She's an amazing and wonderful person. We're so excited to have you, and Janae knows her as well. So we're just thrilled that Rebecca could come and join us today. So without further ado, future Dr. Rebecca Israel Cross, take it away.
All right, thank you for that introduction. And I will say that I know Janae because we were trying to recruit her to come to UCLA and she chose Michigan, but it's okay. We forgive you for that, of course. I wanted to actually go to Michigan too, but my partner, who is from the South, was not about that cold life. And so I was like, we'll stay in the warm weather. And so we stayed at UCLA. So I will go ahead and share my screen really quickly. And get started. All right. So thank you all for having me. I'm extremely excited to be presenting this to you. This is the first time in a long time that I presented on the elaboration model. So it was exciting to get back into this work and come up with these slides and stuff. I will also say that this is kind of a very busy and hectic time, I think, for all of us, trying to figure out, still being in Zoom land and not really understanding and being used to that yet, but then also the election and everything else that's going on in the world with a pandemic. So I just want to be mindful of how many words I have on the slides and things like that. So feel free to write in the chat, raise your hands. I have you all on gallery view, so I can see if you raise your hands if you have any questions, if I'm going too fast or whatever. I also, on the note of the election, want to shout out the state of Michigan. Thank you for coming through. We appreciate you across the country. It was like biting our nails, waiting for the results to come in, but we're very excited and grateful for the good folks organizing for political change in Michigan. So I'll go ahead and get started. So it's my understanding that this, I was gonna say quarter, but y'all went out on a quarter system. This semester, you have been learning about public health theory and behavior change theories. And really what I saw from the Cahoots quiz is that you kind of have a really firm grasp of what theory is and how to use it for research purposes and also for intervention purposes, right? Public health interventions. And so I won't kind of do my spiel on what theory is and why it's important. But today, my talk, I want to just try to build on what you've already learned to provide some new tools for your toolbox and really trying to make the connection between model building, so conceptual model building, and data analysis. And so for some of you, I'm assuming if you all are kind of in your first year of your MPH programs, that you are kind of required to take a biostatistics class or a number of biostatistics class or data methods or data analysis classes. And so I'm not going to be too heavy on the stats stuff, but I do think it's important for us to remember that there is, an iterative relationship or intimate connection between theory and data analysis. So a lot of folks think about theory as something that's esoteric, that's abstract, but it is very closely tied to data analysis and things that are going on in the real world. And so the theories that you all have read about this semester are not just what people are thinking about what's going on. They're the result of years of fine tuning through data analysis. So just as people should not kind of just take some data and think about the interesting ways that constructs are related to each other, people shouldn't really go out and come up with these theories that are not rooted in kind of the real world experiences of people. And so that's why we use theory. So you might hear things like, and this is kind of more so for my economist friends, that, well, we don't use theory, right? We just need to get into the data and see what's happening, but we don't want theory to kind of bias the way that we, understand data. And to that, I respond, nah, it's not possible. So I think we all kind of use theory to guide our analysis, and sometimes they may not be the formal theories that you've learned about in class this semester, but we all have kind of mental models of how we think the world is working. And I think the important thing for us as public health people, and particularly people that are trying to move to improve health, right? We have a directionality with our work. It's not just that we're trying to understand health. No, we're trying to improve health, that we're explicit about the theory that we're using, so that people who are reading our work or who are participating in our programs or evaluating our programs understand how we think things are actually working. So I'm going to return to this model really quickly, just for you to remember that theory should be guiding our analysis, or I could also change out the analysis with like program evaluation, and then also our data analysis, our program evaluation should be refining the theory to basically say, okay, with this population, this theory does or does not hold, and so we need to refine it in these ways. And some theories have been refuted. So you think about certain things like broken windows theory, which is this idea that kind of poverty is reproduced by abandoned buildings and things of that nature. That was a very popular theory kind of in the early 90s, and a lot of scholars have really refuted that theory with actual data. And so this is kind of an iterative process that happens over time. And so when you either design programs or when you design research projects, you're going to be part of this kind of community of scholars and community of practitioners that plays a role in, refining or refuting theories that already exist, and sometimes developing your own theories. So I want to get into two models of explanation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional model of explanation, which you may be familiar with if you have already taken your biostatistics class. And then I'm going to talk about the elaboration model, which is kind of the crux of the talk for today. And so if you have taken a biostatistics class, sometimes they will, like in your various labs or exercises, they'll ask you to kind of explain the variation in your Y or your outcome of interest. So for this talk, I'm going to use the outcome of interest as physical activity. It's not really what I study, but I just submitted my dissertation proposal today. And so like, I'm kind of over that, and I want to talk about something a little different. So for the talk, I'm going to just talk through physical activity as the main outcome of interest. So if you are using the traditional mode of explanation, the goal is to figure out all of the variation in your outcome of interest. So let's say you have a group of people that you're surveying and you're interested in physical activity. You want to find all of the variables, all of the X variables or independent variables that help explain statistically the differences between people who are physically active and people who aren't physically active. So this is kind of a simplified model of the traditional model of explanation. But what the kind of more complicated model of explanation is, kind of looks like this, right? You're interested in the circle B. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the goal is to really explain all of the variation in B. And that can mean, we're looking at, 5 or 10 or 20 different X variables. And then when we get to the end of our analysis, we can say, well, 60% of the variation in physical activity is due to these 20 or 50 or however many variables, right? This is a fine way to do analysis. It helps us kind of get a description of kind of what's happening in the world. But when it becomes problematic is, how do we then take this analysis and use it for intervention design, right? How do we take this analysis and use it to improve physical activity, right? If we're thinking about all of these 25 different variables, we don't actually have a clear understanding of where to intervene, how to intervene, what to do, how these people actually differ in a kind of meaningful way. We just know 60% of the variation in physical activity is due to all of these variables. So I think the traditional model of explanation can be very useful for description, but it's not really useful for action in a lot of ways. And so that brings us to the elaboration model, which you all have read about. And you kind of read the background around making the connection between the theoretical world and the empirical world and things. So I won't get into that detail, but the key difference between the elaboration model and the traditional model is that we're actually only interested in understanding the relationship between these two focal variables. So we're interested in our X and we're interested in our Y. So we're interested in the independent variable and we're interested in the dependent variable, which is the Y. And so how do we pick an independent variable to focus on? That's where the theory comes in, right? And so we'll go into that a little bit. But what happens with the elaboration model is that it has this focal relationship. And as you talk through or noticed in your quiz, in the Kahoots quiz, is that we kind of elaborate the relationship between these two variables by including third variables. And so again, it's not as simple as it kind of looks here in this Venn diagram, and we'll go into the model later. But we're really focused on explaining the relationship between the X and the Y. So you wouldn't just look at two variables, obviously that's very boring, but you use the theory. So whatever theory that you're interested in either testing or refining to guide what variables you add to the model. So again, it's not just, oh, I think this is related to this, and so I'm gonna plop in all of these boxes and arrows into my model, but you say, okay, well, if this theory argues that this X variable that we're related to, that we're interested in is related to these other variables, then that is something that we're gonna include in the model. And so we do this with the elaboration model using two strategies. So there's the exclusionary strategy, where you rule out alternative explanations that could possibly explain the relationship between your independent and your dependent variables. And then you use the inclusionary strategy, which helps kind of clarify the relationship between the two variables of interest, or the focal relationship. So I'm going to start with explaining the exclusionary strategy, then I'm going to do the inclusionary strategy, and then we're going to go into an example, and then we're going to kind of wrap up, and then we'll talk through some questions if you have any questions. So, so this is kind of half of the elaboration model. And I'm sorry my lines are so thin. I could have made them a little bit bigger to kind of see where the directions are going. I have like this really big computer screen, and so I realize that everybody doesn't have this big old screen. But that being said, so the exclusionary strategy rules out alternative explanations for the association between your focal variables. And really this idea is to think through what other theories might explain your relationship between your independent and your dependent variables. And what you want to do is include them in your model, because you're going to test the model using data to rule those out. So if you're saying I'm using, and I'm just going to use like A, B, C theories, because we're going to talk about a specific theory later. If I'm using A theory and other people will say, well, that theory is not valid, actually, you should be thinking about this relationship using B theory, then you include variables that are related to B theory, not to test them at the same time, but to say, actually, my relationship still stands even though I'm taking into account B theory. So it can't just be B theory, because, I still have this statistical relationship that's standing. And so that's really the goal with adding what you see here is the rival independent variables, and then also rival intervening variables. So these could be, there's a certain link between the independent variable and the dependent variable that you're not taking into consideration that might explain, that doesn't really have to do with your theory. It's like, okay, put those in the model as well. And then we'll see whether or not the statistical relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable exists. So if you're familiar with, very, simple kind of ordinary least squares regression, when you put additional variables into the model, sometimes the coefficient, which is kind of the number that tells you what the statistical relationship is between the two variables, sometimes the coefficient will go down, right? And that means the variable that you included, so here the rival independent or the rival intervening, actually does explain some of the relationship. But if the relationship between the independent and the dependent is still statistically significant, then it doesn't explain all of it. And so it's fine that, some of these rival independent variables or rival intervening variables explain some of the relationship, as long as it doesn't explain all of it. And then you can say, okay, this theory is still something that's worth pursuing. So those are the two rival kind of variables that you're going to include. Additionally, the exclusionary variable, the exclusionary strategy requires that you think through control variables. And so these are variables that impact both the independent and the dependent variable. So if we're thinking about, I think the example that I use later is thinking about the relationship between segregation and physical activity. A control variable is something that impacts whether or not you are living in a segregated neighborhood, and also whether or not you're engaging in physical activity, right? And so those are the things that you want to control for, because they might kind of explain some of that relationship too, right? And so something like age, for example, you want to control for age because, older people tend to live in certain types of neighborhoods, and they also engage in less physical activity. So if you kind of standardize age by controlling for it, then you kind of reduce the noise that is involved in having that control variable not included. And so there might be other kind of control variables that are of interest that you want to include. And so all of those things you can kind of include in the model as well. And so I'm going to move on to the inclusionary strategy, which is kind of the top half of the elaboration model. And the inclusionary strategy is really helpful in, this is kind of the, what other people will call kind of mediating variables oftentimes. And then I'll talk a little bit later, I don't have a slide on it, on moderators or modifiers. People use different terms, but there's another kind of third variable you can add to the model. But the inclusionary strategy seeks to incorporate variables that actually help to explain the relationship according to the theory that you're testing, or according to the theory that you're trying to refine. And so the antecedent variables that are kind of in the top left corner of your screen are variables that actually that cause the independent variable. And so this one doesn't actually need to be in the model. It can be, of course, but it doesn't need to be. And this one kind of just helps make the case that this is a relationship that has kind of a historical foundation. And then it also kind of helps to understand, well, maybe sometimes it's not necessarily the independent variable that you're interested in, but sometimes it's the antecedent variables that are really the ones that are causing the dependent variable. And so sometimes that's why you want to think about including antecedent variables as well. But I think the main goal of the inclusionary strategy is to think through this idea of intervening variables or mediating variables that help explain the relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. And so this kind of helps to highlight what we like to call causal mechanisms. So it's one thing to say segregation is associated with physical activity, because we can see a statistical association, but you kind of improve causal inference if you can tell us how. Like, what is it about segregation? What does segregation cause, or what does segregation do that actually impacts physical activity? And that's what the intervening variables can give you a sense of when you add them to the model. And so similarly with control variables, statistically, they kind of all do the same thing. It's really about how you interpret them, but you add it to the model. And if you see that the coefficient is reduced between the independent and the dependent variables, then you kind of get a sense that, okay, this intervening variable or this mediator explains some of the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. And sometimes you'll add an independent, or you'll add an intervening variable to the model, and it explains all of the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And that's okay too. So that is just basically saying that the only reason why segregation is associated with physical activity is because segregation does insert whatever the intervening variable is. And we'll get into that in the next slide. And then finally, the consequent variables are variables that stem from or are caused by the dependent variable. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog, she's not feeling well. She's like whining beneath me. It's very distracting. And so the consequent variables are oftentimes things that result from the dependent variable. So again, if you're thinking about, if we're continuing with our example of physical activity, you know, heart disease could be a consequent variable of being physically inactive, or other types of things that come from lack of physical activity. Okay. So this is the model kind of all together. And again, this is kind of very complicated. But if you take it kind of step at a time and think through, you know, think through the theory that you're interested in testing, and then think through kind of what are the rival theories that might explain the relationships that I'm interested in. You kind of think through those variables, think through the ones that you want to exclude, kind of do the exclusionary first. And then if there's still a relationship after excluding all of the potential rivals and controls, then you want to include your intervening variables to really elucidate or explain how the independent variable is related to the dependent variable. So that was a lot. Let's get into our example. I talked about this already, but we are, for the next 5 minutes or so, going to focus on residential racial segregation and physical activity. And so the theory that I chose to operate from to explain this relationship is critical race theory. And I chose this one because I saw that you all read some critical race theory stuff for this class. And so I really want to kind of think through what developing or building this model might look like using critical race theory. And so let's get started. So critical race theory broadly, when you're thinking about it from a health perspective and public health and health behaviors perspective, argues that racism shapes health behaviors through the inequitable distribution of health promoting resources. And I might also add health harming exposures. So it's not just, certain neighborhoods, have grocery stores and things like that, and others don't, but it's also that certain neighborhoods with certain people are also like more exposed to pollution and violence and police surveillance and other things that actually harm health. So it's both. Right. And so one of the ways in which segregation is associated with physical activity in particular, that has been argued by critical race theorists or people using a critical race perspective, has been thinking through the ways that segregation shapes the access to recreational space in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Right. So that would be kind of our intervening or mediating variable between segregation and physical activity. So again, we're going to start with the exclusionary strategy. So there are a number of things that we can think through that might explain the relationship between physical activity and segregation that are not related to the access to racism related distribution of health promoting resources. So for example, the first thing I thought of, and these two variables are related, is that maybe it's not racial segregation. So maybe it's not this racial component of neighborhood inequality, but maybe it's just neighborhood poverty, right? So you also, for this model, you would want to include neighborhood poverty in the model to make sure that you're accounting for the levels of kind of co-association between segregation and neighborhood poverty, because neighborhood poverty also might explain some of the variation in physical activity. Next, you want to think through the rival intervening variables. And so one of the things that we sometimes hear, if any of you are kind of interested in or read through the neighborhood effects research, you'll find that there is oftentimes this explanation that, you know, in segregated neighborhoods, there's just not good role models, right? There's just not a culture of health in these neighborhoods. And so maybe the exercise culture can actually explain the relationship between segregation and physical activity. And it's not so much that there is a racism related factor, but it could be that people in segregated neighborhoods actually just don't have the examples to look at of people running or people, you know, going to the gym or being physically active. And so it's just the culture of the neighborhood, right, that doesn't promote physical activity. That could be an intervening, a rival intervening variable. And then for the last part of the exclusionary strategies, you want to think through some control variables. And so I'll kind of reuse the one I used earlier to think about age. And so there are a number of reasons why age might be associated with segregation and physical activity. So that's just one control variable that we might use in this model. So I'll go ahead and go to the inclusionary strategy. And so for this strategy, I won't focus too much on the housing policy and the heart disease, or the antecedent variable and the consequent variable, but I really want to focus here on the access to public parks. Right? And so one of the things that critical race theorists have shown, or people who use critical race theory perspective have shown, is that segregation is actually associated with public funding for public parks. And people who live in segregated Black and Latino neighborhoods, particularly, I've been in California for 8 years, so I'm going to use some examples from California, but particularly in this state, when you look at different measures on property tax, different ways in which we collect property tax from people, there have been a number of laws and policies that have been put in place that kind of hoard money to white neighborhoods in order to fund their public parks. And then public parks in segregated neighborhoods have been defunded, have been closed, have been sold off to businesses and things like that. And so part of what critical race perspective might link these connections is to say, well, segregation is associated with access to public parks. Those living in segregated neighborhoods, Black and Latino neighborhoods, have less access to public parks, which is a means by which people can engage safely in physical activity. And so that might explain some of this relationship between living in a segregated neighborhood and physical activity. So this is the entire model of using critical race theory to explain the relationship between segregation and physical activity. So again, like I mentioned before, we start with the exclusionary strategy to think through potential rival independent variables and potential rival intervening variables. We think through some of our controls that actually impact both the independent and the dependent variables. And then lastly, we think about how to elaborate on the relationship between segregation and physical activity. And so from here, the next step would be then to test this model using actual data. So this is kind of thinking through the theories and saying, these are the models, the variables that I want to include in the model, right? So building the model. And then the next step would then be to say, okay, if this is my model that I want to test, or I want to refine, or I want to understand if it actually matches the real world, then you need to go find data. And so obviously we don't have time to talk about that, but there are a number of, if you wanted to kind of test this model, there are a number of public data sources that you might be able to use. And then you kind of work through the data analysis in the same way that I kind of worked through building the model. And so I really like the elaboration model in this, explained in this way, because especially for those of us who don't feel comfortable, super comfortable with statistics, this is a really good way to visualize what you're doing in a statistical model, in a statistical analysis, to really understand when you're including certain variables in the model, when you're not including them, and then helps with interpretation of, what it means to be a rival intervening variable, what it means to be a control. Because like I mentioned before, statistically, you do the same thing with the variables. You put them in the regression, and then numbers pop up. But what you're using the model for is to interpret what these variables actually mean for your results, to talk about how to explain the relationship between the two focal variables that you're interested in. So just a reminder, this is one way to build a conceptual model that is, deeply intertwined with, how you would do your data analysis. But there are a number of other ways that I think you kind of read about this in the past few weeks in class. So I'm happy to take questions. That is the end of my talk. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, to read the rest of Carol Ann Essential's book on theory-based data analysis. Is very, well, maybe you don't agree because you read part of it, but for me, I thought it was a really good introduction to doing research or theory-based research. And so I really, really appreciate that book, and it's pretty readable. So I highly suggest that you read the whole thing. And that's it. So thank you all for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Are there questions, maybe one or two, that we can pitch to Rebecca before she takes care of her dog and her little one?
Oh, and yes. Dr. Anderson added that my advisor, Dr. Chandra Ford, you all read her work on the critical race, the public health critical race praxis.
And there are also some students, I'm sorry, Rebecca, there's also some students who saw you last semester when you guest lectured for my undergrad class. So they're getting a double dose of your fantasticness.
Hey.
I've got one quick question. If students, I know they're sending some thank you messages. If there are no other questions, just a super quick question with respect to making the best choice. So you showed a model that clearly you thought about. You had theory to inform why you made choices around those variables. Take it to the data set, you think everything is going to work really well, and then you don't have the statistical relationships that you expected. Like, what do you do at that point? Or like, why does that happen?
I'll mute myself. Yeah, I think that is a great question. I think it often happens. And so sometimes what you'll see is that people will try to just finagle with the data to make it fit what they want it to say. And I would say that is the wrong way to approach it. I think the important thing is to then, if you kind of run the data, you run the analysis, and it's like, okay, this actually has no support for my theory, then sometimes you have to go back to the theory and go back to the literature and read, what it is about that population maybe that the theory doesn't kind of hold for that population. You have to understand like how the sample was created. And then sometimes, again, the theory is wrong, and that's okay too. And I think part of the culture of, having certain hypotheses be proven and like getting papers published, we kind of get caught up in wanting to be right all the time. But I think it's more important to get it right because we want to improve health, not because we want to be right necessarily. So I would always say if the data actually doesn't support the theory, go back and think about ways that you might refine the theory to make it make sense with the data that you have. And then also consider whether or not the theory is a useful theory anymore, because sometimes we just have to get rid of those theories and kind of think through other theories that can explain the relationships that we're interested in.
Well, if there is nothing else, I'll wait just 10 more seconds. If there's nothing else from our illustrious students, Rebecca, we thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on submitting today. What a big accomplishment. Yes. Make sure that you're resting and getting yourself some congratulatory cupcakes or something.
Probably not cupcakes, but it's going to be something delicious though.
That's all I could ask for. Well, take wonderful care. Thank you again so much.
Have a great day. Thank you all for having me. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions about what I talked about.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Have a great week.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye. All right. Yes, she did an amazing job. We're so grateful for her time. And again, just wanting to also demonstrate for both Janae and Rebecca being in a doc program. Sometimes there's a lot of things that even at a step ahead. So for folks who are thinking about doctoral programs, just a really good sense that you're going to be doing this potentially for that PhD program, but also here in the master's program, it's going to be required of you to create conceptual models as well. So we want to get you as well versed as we possibly can with that. So we're going to come back to this one more time just to make sure that as you're leaving this class, you have a really good handle, not only on what it looks like, but how to potentially create one for yourself. So we've been working together to do some identification of this. So what we're going to do today is identify and then make a very quick, shallow conceptual model for ourselves based on some of the things that we learned on Monday and today. So I'm going to throw this poll back up here. Again, you all did such a great job with this. I don't mean to click that button. You did a really great job on Monday in answering this question. So we're going to launch it one more time, and the goal is to get 100% this time. So let's give it a go one more time based on what it is that we talked about Monday. Rebecca used some of the same terms today, but trying to address what these boxes are. So again, what is A, B, C, D, and E based on the numbers of the variable types here. So we've got mediator, outcome, predictor, moderator, and antecedent. Match those with the letters, give it a go. And yes, Taz, cake pops, clearly that's way more delicious than cupcakes. We should have recommended that for sure. Thus far, we're at 100%, y'all. I'm excited. Keep it going. No like pressure or anything of that sort. A little bit. You all are kicking tush. The numbers are coming in. Yes, yes. 100% across the board. Oh yeah, keep it coming. I'm so excited. Oh yeah, halfway there, 100% all the way. This is all it takes is cake pops and correct answers on quizzes. As you can see, it's a very simple life that I lead. Let's take about 30 more seconds. We're still kicking tush. Got about 20 more folks who have to submit. Got about 15 seconds to go. Five, four, three, two, and I'm gonna end this poll. All right, so very, very close to 100%. We want to just remind ourselves what these things are before we try to create them ourselves. So for number one, or excuse me, for A, this is the variable that predicts what it is that we see in the rest of the model. So starting with A, this would be our predictor, or number 3. For B, this is what mediates the relationship. And I thought about this in my dreams, because that's just how much I think of you all. I thought about what a mediator is. Think about someone who listens to both sides of the story. If you think about who a mediator might be in a relationship, if a couple is having an issue and they go to see someone, or if 2 people are having a problem, right, and they see someone else, the mediator helps to explain to each other what the issue is, what the tension is. So that's what B is. It's helping to explain what A is trying to say, and B is now sharing that information or explaining it to C. So it's taking what would be this relationship from A to E, and it is explaining it through what we call mediation or statistical mediation. So that's what B is. That is the mediator there. C, what gets us information about that predictor as an antecedent. So anything A and T as a prefix is before, right? So antecedent is talking about before. It helps to tell us more information about this predictor variable. D is our moderator, or again, what I like to call the seesaw. It's what modulates a relationship. So anytime you see an arrow that's pointing at a line, it helps to seesaw or to modulate what the relationship between B and E. So if B and E have a relationship, the strength of D helps to let us know about just how much that relationship between B and E will teeter. So D, if you're saying, for example, a high level of blank, let's say exercise, right? If B and E are dietary intake and weight, for example, D will help to modulate or regulate what B and E, the strength of B and E's relationship. And finally, E, what comes at the end of a model, that is our outcome variable. That is what depends on the predictor and some of these other variables to be what they are. Let me just check the chat real quick. Okay. So Jadrian, a mediator and a moderator. I'll explain it one more time, but let me know in the chat if that was clear what I just went through. But the mediator, again, is something that helps to explain. So again, if A and E typically have a relationship, but they're not like, if B can explain it a bit better. So if what A tells B and then what B tells E is a better way of communicating between A and E, then B, as that mediator, is going to help to explain the relationship between A and E. Whereas a moderator is a variable that keeps the relationship between B and E, but it just explains the strength of it. So when I put in a moderator, it's going to either increase the relationship or decrease based on what D is. So D doesn't explain, but it exemplifies. It either increases or decreases, whereas B takes away or explains the relationship between A and E. So Jadrian, if you need more about that, drop that in the chat and I'll come back to it. But hopefully that was a bit more clear. Okay, so let's keep it rolling real quick. We also had the building models order the steps from before. So just because we're coming up at time and I want to make sure that we have enough time to practice some of these things, I'm going to just drop this back in here so that you can see the order of the steps. So the first thing that you want to do is specify the outcome of interest, your why, right? So your why is the thing that you want to understand what we're going to do something about. So get your outcome of interest or your why in your head. Think about an existing model as a starting point. So we're going to use exactly what the model was that we just showed to kind of start off with what if we had some relationships that work together like this. Select potential correlates of the outcome, or what are the things that are related to that outcome will be the next step. Then we want to start drawing arrows. So what are those initial relationships? What are some of the theories that can help us to put some of those relationships together? What are the pieces of knowledge that we already have about that are going to not only tell us that these things are related, but in what direction that relation would be, right? So does one thing relate to an increase in something or a decrease? Those are things that are going to be impacted by our empirical evidence and personal knowledge. And then finally, we create those linkages. So after we've thought about it and we put it on wax a bit, we're going to be able to draw those lines. And then, as Rebecca just indicated, at some point, test it out with data. So someone is off mute. I just want to let you know in case something pops off in the background. Just let you know to check your mute on that. Holly asks, would the moderator be an indication of the strength or a number? Can you come off mute and help me understand a bit more on what that means? Oh, like what we use strong?
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just wondering, could it be a numerical value? Like if you have like some sort of legend and you're like 10 is a really strong indicator and 1 is really weak, or would it just be like language based to describe that relationship?
Yes. Yep. So let's actually do this all together here. So I know that Janae worked with you all on these boxes. What I would love for you to do is to take out a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. If you have a tablet or something of that sort that you can write on, that's fine too. But I want you to actually do this. So this is not an exercise just for you to watch with your eyes. I want you to actually take out something and give this a shot. Before you do it for yourself, though, I'm going to explain Holly's inquiry real quick. All of the things that go in these boxes are variables. So you would again, as Janae was typing in on Monday, you would never say like a high level of this or increase of this, or you wouldn't give any value to it outside of the name of the variable. So for each of these things, you're going to write in something that you believe is related to this outcome. So for yourself, start with E. So you can literally draw these boxes on your paper and I'll join you. So for your E, think about your why. What is the thing that really interests you in the field of public health in terms of an outcome of interest? So I've said a number of times for me that it is mental health. So I'm going to put mental health in that box all the way to the right, my outcome variable, or E. I'm going to put mental health in that box. What we discussed on Monday was to think about what variables predict that outcome. So for your A box, and again, this is a very like crass way of doing it. You would never start with just the model. You would think about a number of these things, right? As we've explained in the prior slide, you want to really give thought to what all of these variables could look like. And with what Rebecca just said, you really want to refine what these variables are through a number of practices on your model. So you would never just start with this, but I want you to actually physically get the chance to create a model for yourself before you encounter this in the next class that you have. So I do want you to think about what is the thing that predicts your outcome of interest. So for me, mental health is predicted, especially in Black children, by racial discrimination. So my X or my A variable on here is racial discrimination. So I'm going to put that in my box. One thing that I know that predicts racial discrimination as an antecedent is residential location, where people live. So that's one antecedent that I'm going to put in my box. And again, if we were doing this in real life, like we showed you last class, there are hella variables that you put in any one of these things, right? But for purposes of today, I'm just going to put one. So residential location. So my bottom line, and I always write on my mail, that's tragic, but racial discrimination here, or excuse me, residential location leads to racial discrimination, which leads to mental health. So that's what my C, A, and E look like right now. So on your sheet, you should have what you really care about, that health outcome, as an E variable. Your A should be something that predicts that E variable. And your C should be something that tells us a bit about the A. Why do we even see that in the first place? So the two variables that can often be very tricky, the B and the D, I just, again, want you to be able to have an idea, to give it a shot on paper. So I'm going to draw an arrow from racial discrimination and from whatever box I'm going to put there to mental health. So the question is, what variable explains racial discrimination and mental health? What I've shown you before in some of my models, which have a number of mediators, so that it might be several mediators long of explanation, but one of those mediating variables is coping. So racial discrimination and mental health have a strong connection, but coping explains it a bit better. So it's not just that I've been discriminated against that makes me sad, but racial discrimination makes my coping strategies limited. And because I have limited coping strategies, that then leads to lower mental health because I don't really know how to deal with that discrimination that came my way. So it explains the relationship between discrimination and mental health a bit better than just that direct relationship. So that's why coping goes in my B box. So I want you to think about a variable that helps us to better understand why there's even a relationship between A and E in the first place for your box. And then finally with D, I'm going to put an arrow here. D as the moderator, this is going to be a variable that, depending on its strength, is going to tell us about the relationship between B and E in a different way. So here, for example, I might say the racial identity that a child has is going to help to explain or help to modulate coping and mental health. So here's an example of that. If my racial identity were high, if I had a high level of racial identity, if I believed that being Black is a beautiful thing, even though my coping is still impacted by racial discrimination, I'm not going to have as strong of a relationship between coping and mental health because I know who I am and I know why that problem exists. It's not me. It's not an individual problem. It's a historical, it's a cultural problem that other people have. So that moderator of racial identity is going to help to say, even though coping and mental health typically have a relationship, because my racial identity is high, I'm going to tip that scale so that it's not as strong of a relationship anymore. My racial identity being high helps to decrease the relationship between B and E. So I know that was a lot, and I know we're at 2:05. Do I have one person who wants to tell me what some of their variables are, just to give it a quick stab? If you want to tell me what your AE is at the least, and then we can put in C, B, and D if you're willing to go that far as well. But somebody tell me what their X and their Y is at the very least.
I can.
Thanks, Jackson.
So I'm gonna turn my video off so I don't freeze. So my A was social isolation. Okay. My A was essentially bullying. And my E was mental health outcome.
Great.
My C was like high weight status or living in a large body, higher BMI, or being diagnosed with obesity.
Okay.
My B was having access to healthy food, a safe place to exercise, a social circle or friends to do physical activities with. And then my D, I was thinking would be like self-image or body image.
Okay, so you have some really thoughtful ways of including all of those variables in, and I appreciate you so much for giving that a shout. If other folks want to talk through theirs, again, you're welcome to share it with me in office hours, or if you want to hang out after class a bit, that's great. Thank you, Jackson, again, for your demonstration. I want to make sure that we talk through the op-ed today before class is over. So again, if you have questions or thoughts, feel free to hang out afterwards or to schedule some time in office hours, or drop it in the chat and maybe we can get Janae to fill in a bit on that as well. All right, so I want to talk a bit about what the heck an op-ed is. So if you can, I'm going to share the in-class activities here. So if you can go ahead and click on the in-class activities document, I'm going to walk you through what an op-ed is, what the heck it looks like, etc. So we're going to, also on the syllabus, I've created the rubrics. I'm also going to drop that in the chat as well. And we'll be able to look at both of those at the same time. So if you scroll down on the syllabus to page, my computer is moving very slowly, so 1 minute, I'll tell you what that is. All right, if you scroll down to page 12, you'll get a chance to see the rubric that we're going to be using for the op-ed. So just keep your eye on that as well. But the first thing that we're going to do for our in-class activity, you'll see the first line of the in-class activity says, read this webpage on how to write an op-ed. So go ahead and click on that hyperlink of how to write an op-ed, and you'll find yourself on the op-ed project's website. The op-ed project is exactly what it sounds like, a group of folks who are training people on how to write better op-eds. And so you'll see a number of things on this website, including tips and tricks, but there's a structure piece, and the structure has a number of elements that I put in your rubric so that you can see what it is that we'll be looking for when we grade. So it has a lead, and if you click on any of the plus symbols, you'll see an explanation of what these things are. A lead is like a hook. It's an introduction to your piece. A thesis then states your argument. So it could be explicit or implied, but it is where you state your argument of what's going on in the work. And then the argument itself is where you're taking evidence like stats, news, etc., to talk a bit more about what it is that your point is going to be for your op-ed. And I should start with, if folks are not familiar with the term op-ed, an op-ed is opinion editorial. So it's when you're taking your thoughts, your content, your knowledge, and then you're sharing it with other people with respect to what they should do, right? So you're taking your content, your knowledge, your expertise, and then you're sharing with other people what you should do. So for your argument, you're trying to support your expertise with evidence. And this is the first chunk of your paper. So again, lead is like a hook or introduction. And then you've got other elements of the introduction, which are the thesis and then the data that supports your thesis. Then you've got what is described as first point, second point, and third point. So typically, if you want to move someone, you want to give them really clear and easy ways of addressing what it is that you want to do. So it might be enough just to say to wear a mask, right? But we know that there are things that are going to impact one's mask wearing. So if you had to lay out 3 points, what would they be? And for each of those points, you want to give evidence to what it is that those folks are, or what it is that you're asking someone to do, and you want to wrap that component up with a conclusion. So for each of those 3 points, you want to utilize the same type of strategy, and it's about 3 sentences or so each. So a sentence on evidence, another sentence on evidence, and then a concluding point. So 3 of those. The to be sure paragraph I really like, because you're essentially saying, listen, while these things might be true, here's another way of thinking about it. So you're preempting what it is that other people might say about, well, what about this? Or what if this? You're saying, okay, to be sure, those things do exist. They are limitations, they are challenges, but here's how we're going to move past that. And then finally, your conclusion, which often circles back to your lead, puts a bow on this piece. So again, for those of you that may not be as familiar with an op-ed is you writing. You're essentially writing, but it's a strategy or a style of writing that says, I'm an expert in this and I want to provide information to you, the reader, as to what to do about this problem. So that is and I want you to go ahead and take your time to read through some of the elements on the op-ed project, which will give you more information about how to write some of the things that we just saw on our structure. But if you want to go back to your in-class activity sheet or the Google Doc, go ahead to where it says op-ed examples on mask wearing and click on this first example. So it's Kentucky.com, opinion op-ed. Click on that link down here. And we're going to actually go through this person's op-ed together so that you can see where these elements are in this person's op-ed. So I'm going to share my screen. I have this as a Word doc on my screen, and I hope this works. I'm going to try to annotate with you all so that you can see what strategies this person is using. Yes, Carly, mask hole. I love it. I love it. Okay, so again, if you want to pull up the Kentucky article, you can. If not, it's on my screen. It's just that you can't read all of it at the same time. So let's try to get the annotate going here. All right. So wearing a mask doesn't infringe on freedom. It saves lives. Don't be a mask hole is what this person is arguing in their opinion. And we'll see what it is that they want us to do. People who don't wear masks in public think that they won't get COVID-19, or if they do, it won't harm them. For some, not wearing a mask is a political symbol, a way to assert group identity and feel superior to, quote, sissy liberals or whoever and however they characterize, quote, them. But the main purpose of wearing of a mask is not to protect the wearer from contracting the virus. The purpose of the mask is to prevent the asymptomatic mask wearer from spreading the virus. You, quote, mask holes who don't wear masks, whether it's because you don't care or because it's a smirking symbol of your politics, are killing your fellow citizen. Here's how. So let's stop there. Already some really strong opinions that this person is asserting, some language that is clearly very interesting based on what this person is saying. The first thing that I want you all to be mindful of is that there are different outlets. So this is a Kentucky article or a Kentucky outlet. And so thinking about the terms that this person is using might be very intentional and wouldn't necessarily fly in other places. But I just want to be mindful of who your outlet is there. But what's something that you all saw that the author was using in this first paragraph to grab readers' attention? What were some of the things that you saw? Or heard?
Well, I mean, kind of to what you were saying about this being specifically in Kentucky, and this person talks about kind of like group identity and as a political symbol, and some of the other terms that they use, like saying like sissy liberals, like that would be you know, that I know I'm not from Kentucky, but I can imagine with Kentucky being a very Republican area, that might be language that some very conservative people in that area might use. And so they might like see that and say, oh yeah, I like, that's like, haha, and kind of joke with it and be like, well, what else does this person have to say?
Right. So thank you for that. It's definitely looking like this person is hooking perhaps with regional language or with this identity statement of who these people are around this author, right? So that's the first thing that we wanted to do, was to find a lead. I'm just gonna make sure that I have the different elements up. So we want to find a lead, and then we want to understand what this person's argument is. So you're, again, making a statement and then you're supporting it with various facts. So the next paragraph, currently 2.5 million coronavirus cases have been diagnosed in the US. 5% of those diagnosed died. The actual number is 10 times higher. Likely infects 2 to 3 other people. If there aren't stay-at-home orders, coronavirus is far more infectious than the flu, with an incubation period of up to 14 days, during which carriers can infect others. What is this person saying in the second paragraph? What are they taking away? Or what are you taking away as the reader?
The second paragraph, I'm going off of the first paragraph, because they say that like masks are not supposed to prevent you from getting it, it's supposed to prevent you from spreading it. And so in the second paragraph, they're saying like, here's how easy it is to spread it, and you know, here's how long you're able to spread it. And so it's kind of providing the like, here's how serious not spreading it is, and kind of setting it up for the rest.
Yeah, so thanks, Lauren. Leah, just because I see your name on the screen, what is it that you're taking away? So it's a lot is what Lauren said, but what else are you taking away from the second paragraph?
So I would say that having those statistics, as I think Simone mentioned in the chat also, is a way to be more impactful about, again, setting up for the later on, continuing on with the statistics as the op-ed goes on, but really just setting up those large numbers of statistics and saying about who's like asymptomatic to really set up that spread is a main issue with the coronavirus.
Thank you so much, Leah. So that's exactly right. And because I have 5 screens up and I'm annotating, the chat is going to be really hard. So feel free to, continue using it, but I'm not going to likely be able to see it. So these next 2 paragraphs really set up this argument very well, that this person is saying that masks are quite important. And here's how we know. They double down and they give quite a bit of information on how one knows that. So I'm going to keep scrolling a bit here. Again, this gets into some really political content. So again, this is not true of every op-ed that you would read. It's not going to fly in every paper you would read, but just to give you an idea of how opinions can vary for various folks. So this person, let's see. This person is making various points. So it's less about, here are some of the ways to wear a mask, right? So it goes over your nose, it goes over, it's less about those 3 types of points here, but this author really gets into why there are challenges to wearing a mask here, why folks might disagree with it, and why folks may be choosing not to wear it. But then this person starts to double down here and is saying it's undisputed. So using really clear language, undisputed that wearing a mask is the most important step we can take to limit the spread of coronavirus. If you worry about the economy, then using a mask is one of the ways to address this and to help us before an effective treatment is found. And then this person really just says, like, it's very clear, just do this. At the end, the only thing that I wanted to show you before we have to close out, and we'll continue to address this on Monday, just so I can show you a few more examples of this. What this person goes on to say is that if you shoot a gun in a crowded environment, it's true that that most of the time the bullet won't hit anyone. So this is going back to the to be sure method that we've talked about. So to be sure, the vast majority of harmful things that somebody might do won't impact anyone. It may not hit 99% of the people, but if it does hit someone, that's a criminal act. To be sure, you are still harming someone, even if it doesn't impact the vast majority of people. So that person is using this strategy here of saying, to be sure, this is important, right? And then at the end, they go back to this idea of what happens if you're wearing if you don't wear a mask, and going back to this idea of mask holes, which they introduced at the beginning. So not everything is going to have the most clear use of every strategy that the op-ed project utilized, but you can see a good number of them within that example. So again, we'll come back to some more of those, but I wanted to at least expose you to it and to show you what, based on the rubric, we're going to be looking for. Some of those elements can be found in there. Okay, super quick ending. I apologize for that. We're trying to keep it to time. So feel free to hop off if you need to, if you want to stay on for a bit to talk about some of your conceptual models or questions on op-eds. I'm happy to keep you up. So have a wonderful day and a great weekend, and I'll see you soon.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So kind of looking through, I know they use some of those statistics, but I don't really see a ton of citation. Is that something that's necessary in an op-ed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've written a number and I hyperlink, but something that editors tell me often is to reduce the number of hyperlinks, because You can just imagine as someone's reading, if there's that blue text that's popping up off the screen, they're not going to get through your work. They're going to keep clicking on the hyperlinks, and that's not going to let them understand your point. So you want to be highly selective about what the hyperlinks are, but likely if it's a statistic that you're dropping, you do want to think about, let me support that, that statistic with a link. So oftentimes when I'm talking about Michigan cases, I'll be sure to say something about Detroit contracting it at rates that are 2 times higher than other cities in the state, or that Black folks in particular contracted more often and pass more often. And those are always hyperlinked and underscored so that folks can see that if they need to. But the rest of it, you do not spend a lot of time hyperlinking or citing.
Yeah, I just want to add that op-eds are like very casual, and it's really like you just saying what your opinion is. And granted, your opinion is based off of things that you've read and based off of data. But it's like you're not required to per se like cite for your opinion, but like your opinion is informed by like a couple of articles that you read, I'm assuming, or something. So like citing like whatever like the key source or the 2 key sources are is pretty helpful towards the end of the paper, but like not like within text. I don't know if Dr. Anderson would agree, but I think
sure.
Like two is nice and helpful.
For sure.
Do they be like scholarly like articles, or can they be gray sources as well?
Certainly gray sources. I don't think I've ever used an academic article in a op-ed in my life. So I find typically, say if I want to submit to the Washington Post, you find other Washington Post articles because it keeps people in that journal. That might be something that's really helpful. Again, if it's a local source, you wouldn't want to disrespect the one paper that you're submitting to by bringing the other local source. So it's just a nod to that you read that source and that you think it's impactful and important. But I've never pulled an academic citation ever into a op-ed.
Okay, but we need at least like some sort of like backup, or can it just be our opinion?
There are no criteria requiring you to pull in any academic resources here. So again, you can hyperlink based on just casual articles that you read, but it doesn't have to be pulling in this. For example, for next week for the dissemination and implementation, you can say like some scholars have indicated that this is important. So again, keeping it casual in language, but you don't have to cite them formally within the article.
All right, thank you. And
thanks.
I wanted to go over D for like the moderators, but I don't want to take up my other classmates' time. So if other people have questions, I can wait till the end.
Thanks, Taz.
I'll go ahead and jump in. It is kind of related to that, so this might actually help. It's just some brief clarification between mediator and moderator. So going off your example in class, Dr. A, for instance, can a mediator for the racial discrimination predictor and outcome on mental health be something perhaps like the physiological stress response that explains the how and the why racial discrimination can have an impact on mental health? And then for the moderator, would something like racial socialization, for instance, serve as a moderator, and when that intervention is done?
Yes, so I'll start with racial social. So that's clearly what I work on. That would be my moderator, and I use that all the time. And with specific respect to interventions, if what I'm arguing is that this connection right here, what you just described, we'll stick with coping just for a second. Coping to mental health. If racial social is the thing that bends this relationship, essentially, like I use this as a spear, right? So it literally like bends that relationship. If I can improve what this is, which is racial socialization, then I'm effectively breaking that relationship. So that is literally an intervention. I'm literally intervening on why this thing impacts that, right? So absolutely. When you say the stress response, then arguably, yes. So if racial discrimination creates more physiological stress responses in the body, and that stress response then tells my mental health that you're not as good because you feel tense in your body, et cetera, that's absolutely another moderator that would be, mediator that would be there. And then the moderator, again, of racial socialization, we're going to help people practice how to reduce their stress. We're going to tell people various strategies to like practice breathing in and out. That's going to reduce that stress response on that mental health outcome. So that helps to, again, like create that bend, like it's not as predictable anymore because we're jacking up the relationship between that stress coping response and that outcome. So that's a beautiful addition, Maria.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. It was just kind of like helping me piece through how to think through these things, but that was great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maria. Other folks?
I had a quick question about the topic of mask wearing for the op-ed. Are we like limited to like the nature of the example given in the sense that we're trying to convince people of the importance of mask wearing? Or can it be a commentary on mask wearing from like other perspectives? Like if we wanted to comment, for example, on like policy interventions and maybe how some of them could be better.
So next week's topic is dissemination and implementation. And what you're going to be reading about is going to address how to disseminate the knowledge that we know and how to implement that into the world. Some of them absolutely are policy related. So if you wanted to bring that element in, you're absolutely going to be reading that content from Monday's reading. And that's going to be very helpful to make that argument. So it'll be much less about how do we wear it, which is some of the content that you've already done throughout the class, and much more, how do we get large scale folks to engage in this? What would it take to disseminate and implement these types of strategies? So that'll be much more aligned with policy in that way.
Gotcha. Okay. And a quick question about the models. Similar to the mediator, could there be like more than one moderator identified in the,
So if you go back to the conceptual models that Janae and I were showing you on Monday, most of them have like 8, 9, 10 boxes of just tons of variables that can be used. The goal is to create a parsimonious model when you're using it for a specific thing. So if I want to analyze some data, I don't want to have 20,000 variables in there because it's going to mess up my ability to run that analysis. If I'm doing a practice-oriented component, I don't want to try 20,000 different things. That's a waste of time for me and my client, and that's a lot of energy, and it's a lot of resources, right? So you just really want to think about, if I only could choose a few, what are going to be the most impactful, like Rebecca was saying today, to get at this outcome that I'm hoping people engage in. But yes, generally speaking, tons of moderators, tons of mediators, all of those things are going to help you to think through those relationships in the model. But when you're actually engaging in the work, you want to be really mindful of the specific things that you're going to target.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. Jackson, you killed it. Social isolation was fantastic. It was a great, great job. Thank you. All right. Jackson, James, Alexis, Caitlin, Taz, anything else?
I had a quick, more, I guess, specific question for the example that I used when I was doing this exercise with the model. So when I was thinking about the antecedent, what's impacting the predictor variable. So for example, my antecedent, if I'm looking at racial discrimination and doctor-patient interactions for birth outcomes for Black birthing people in the US. At first, I was thinking that the antecedent would be racial weathering. I didn't know to what extent that would be influencing that, or would it be another thing that came to my mind was Patricia Hill Collins controlling images and how that could mediate that relationship as well. But I wasn't, and this is also some sociology stuff too, but yeah, I'm just trying to figure out with the racial weathering, I didn't know whether or not that would play a role because I know it's important, but I also feel in terms of the external doctor-patient interaction that maybe it would be less relevant for the conceptual model.
So give me your X again. What was your predictor?
The predictor was racial discrimination in doctor-patient interactions.
And the outcome was maternal.
Yeah, physical and mental health outcomes for Black birthing people after their pregnancy or after their childbirth.
Okay, close. Okay. Racial discrimination. And then weathering. So the weathering, when you say weathering, who is being impacted by weathering?
The Black birthing people.
But not the physician per se, right?
Right, yeah.
So this is where level and specificity get really interesting, right? So if you keep the predictor as an interaction variable, and then you say that interaction variable predicts weathering, you just have to be very specific that the weathering is only impacting one person in that interaction, that it's the mother, for example. But it's challenging. For example, I might say experience of racial discrimination from the mother, right? And then one of the way that you define it can be a host of doctor experiences, right? So it can be, have you experienced discrimination when you go in for your appointment and things of that sort? Because that's going to keep it to the mom's experience of racial discrimination versus between two people. And then that two people interaction goes to one person and then one person. That's going to be interesting to measure an interaction to an individual variable here. It's not impossible, but it's just, it gets interesting when you try to take it to different levels across your model. So you just want to be mindful of that. If it's based on what happens to the mom at the end, you just want to think about to what extent various interactions or different levels are going to be at play. Janae, well, I know Janae just took a bite of something, so let me not do that to you. But I know that you all in public health in particular go through different levels and different relationships a little differently than we do in psychology. So it's not as uncommon. I was just trying to see if Janae had a thought on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to rationalize why weathering would be a predictor and why it wouldn't be a moderator.
Well, I think that's what she said.
I meant the racial weathering as the antecedent.
Right. Why it would be an antecedent.
Gotcha. Oh, I thought you said mediator. Okay, wait.
Oh, no, sorry. My mediator was actually the mediator that I was interested in was the presence of a doula in that situation. And like how that would moderate those doctor-patient interactions.
So, okay. Just because Alexis, I want to be respectful of everyone's time on this.
Sorry.
No, it's not. No. It's no shade on that. If you want to come to office hours so we could chat this out more, that would be great. But I do think, I think you have used some variables interchangeably a few times when you've spoken. So take some time to really just like keep drawing this out. And to Janae's point, figuring out why something would be in a certain place. But let's definitely talk more about that in the office hours if you're willing and able to do that with us.
Yeah, I'll try to look for a good available time.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Taz and Caitlin, we're gonna hop off just because it's time and we wanna be respectful of our time as well. So we're gonna hop off, but Taz, I know I'm seeing you for office hours, I think Friday, right?
Yeah, okay. I think it's tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, so you can go over it then too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, take care, you all. Have a great day.